Well, if you want to talk about a great American road trip, this right here is it. 371 days, 49 states, more than 40,000 miles on the road, averaging around 20 or 21 miles per gallon. More than $16,000 of on-road expenses, not including all of the upfront costs and the cost of the truck and everything like that. And then a bunch of weird stats, like 162 showers, 137 times going to the gym, did laundry about once a month, and I went on 91 hikes, more than 300 miles, and about 25,000 feet of altitude. An absolutely amazing experience that brought me to over 40 national parks, plenty of other parks, and a lot of museums along the way. This right here is one of my favorite pictures from the trip, sitting along the Grand Canyon with a view of the Colorado River on the north rim. Here is the general route that I followed. I started in Virginia in December of 2021, and I decided that winter was coming, so I went south first, picked up a few states along the way, all the way down to Florida before zigzagging my way west. I originally found a website that calculated the most efficient road trip to visit all 48 states, and I kind of followed that. I used some of their destinations, some of the national parks that they talked about, some of the cities and things like that, and I slowly pieced together this amazing road trip with plenty of different stops along the way, and it turned out to not be efficient at all, but that's not what I was going for. I was trying to see as much as I could. Sometimes I had to overlap and stop at different places multiple times and things like that. I think overall it was a great route and solid timing that I chose to go south first and then west. One of the major decision points when I veered off from my original plan was in New Mexico. I originally thought I would go up into Colorado after New Mexico, but it was the spring. I figured I would hit Arizona and Southern California before it got way too hot during the summer. It's kind of hard to tell, but from Colorado I went to Wyoming, Montana, Spokane, Washington, and then off to Alaska. So that's where the graph breaks up in the top left there. I went from Spokane to Alaska, spent a month there, and then made my way back south to Vancouver. Drove along the coast for a little bit, went to Yellowstone because that was closed the first time I drove by due to flooding. Then from there, went back to Denver before going up to the Dakotas and Minnesota, zigzagging my way through the Midwest, and then finally finishing the trip off in the Northeast and a few stops in Canada. What an amazing trip, and if you want a little bit more detailed of a route, I could probably get that for you and show you all of the stops along the way. This particular picture was from Voyageurs National Park in Minnesota. This is the first time I've ever seen the Northern Lights. Alright, so on to the fun part of this. This is all the numbers and the graphs and the data. I'm a big numbers guy, so I really enjoyed keeping track of all the different facets of this trip, and I journaled everything so I could go back. So this is how many nights I stayed in each state. On the left you have a cool little graph that shows boxes for each of the nights. The bigger the box, the more states. And on the right you can see each state chronologically. So I started in Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and I ended in Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Jersey. It's really interesting to see the most nights spent in the states: New Mexico, Canada, Arizona, Alaska, Colorado, all around 20. And that does make sense because I spent a lot of time driving in their bigger states and things like that. There definitely is a positive correlation to how much I enjoyed the state and how many nights I stayed in the state. It's really interesting to look at the bottom right of the graph on the left because I can see the states where I only spent one night in: Wisconsin, Indiana, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Idaho, and Rhode Island. I spent 0 nights in Pennsylvania. I went from Cleveland, Ohio to driving along Lake Erie, and I visited Erie, Pennsylvania and Presque Isle State Park for the day. But then after that day I drove all the way to Buffalo, New York, so I didn't actually spend a single night in Pennsylvania. Now I've been there countless of other times, so it's hard not to count that really. This right here is one of my favorite waterfall pictures from the entire trip. This is a waterfall that I cannot pronounce. I'll tell you, it starts with a T, and it is in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Now if you just search Michigan waterfall, T-A-U, something like that, it'll pop up. It's like Tauganic, something like that. But it's a really cool state park, and I would highly recommend visiting it. Alright, back to the data. This is mileage by state, so similar to nights by state. Some of the bigger states and territories are way up at the top, and if I spent more time in the state, I was probably driving more. So you see Canada, Utah, Alaska, Texas, Arizona, Colorado, Florida, New Mexico, all with 1,500 miles or more. Obviously the most was Canada, driving to and from Alaska. I spent a ton of time in Canada. And then also driving to Montreal and Quebec towards the end of the trip. So it's funny that this is the Great American Road Trip, and the most amount of miles was spent in Canada, but I don't know, that still kind of makes sense, and it's necessary if you want to get up to Alaska and drive the Alcan Highway. What's even more interesting is at the bottom of the list, you can see the least amount of miles per state. So Iowa, only 50 miles. I drove around Davenport for a little bit. Pennsylvania, only 83 miles near Erie. Indiana, only about 100 near Indiana Dunes National Park. And then some of the northeast states, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, are thrown in there as well. This picture is an awesome drone shot from Lake Ouachita in Arkansas. This is about an hour out from Hot Springs, just south of the Ozark National Forest, and there are plenty of camping spots. I highly recommend visiting it. It's full of courts and cool beaches and awesome sunsets, that's for sure. Alright, this is some of the most interesting data from this trip. My most common sleeping locations. Surprise, surprise, number one is Cracker Barrel. I spent around 4 months camping at Cracker Barrel. Whenever I was in a city, I would flock to a Cracker Barrel because I found them to be a little bit more safe than a Walmart parking lot or just out in the open in a street or neighborhood or hotel parking lots or things like that. They have cameras, they're open to overnight parking. Other RVs and rigs stay there as well. So I really tried to even plan some of my stops around Cracker Barrel. Other common spots, just random streets. I slept in campgrounds for 35 nights, Walmart 29, dispersed camping 28, houses 28. I really tried to find free spots as much as possible. I did not want to ever pay for an RV park or a really expensive campground. That means whenever I was in a city or a town, I had to fend for myself, so I really just parked on streets or hotel parking lot or, you know, whatever really. Some of the interesting spots where I only slept a night or two at, I slept at a church parking lot once. The pastor mistook me for someone trying to break in, and I had to tell him, no, I just thought this was a safe place to sleep, so that was an interesting experience. Even a college parking lot once at Ithaca College in New York. Boat landing on a boat, Bass Pro Shop, beach twice in Texas, and apartment parking lot twice. This is one of my favorite drone shots again. This is from, I forget what lake, but it's along the Alcan Highway and it's in Canada. If you drive the Alcan, you'll see plenty of lakes like these and they're just absolutely pristine. Alright, on to the money portion. This is my expenses by category. More than half of my expenses went to gas, around 56%, and around $10,000. Now this was expected. I am not paying rent currently. I don't have a lease, no mortgage. So this is kind of my living expense, and I was expecting to pay a large chunk on gas, and that I did. Other than that, a few $1,000s on groceries and recreation, and then some of the other expenses like truck expenses, food, dining out, that wasn't included in the groceries category, a decent amount on wood, oil changes, a few bar visits, a couple nights in a hotel, a few haircuts that I didn't give myself, parking in cities, bought a few fishing licenses toward the beginning of the trip as well. Now, if anything, this is underreported. This is what I kept my receipts for. So I kept my receipts 90% of the time. I probably missed maybe $1,000, at most $2,000 worth of expenses. And they probably fell in the same distribution as shown here, so mostly gas. The things I missed were probably like food, when I didn't keep the receipt at like a McDonald's, or I don't know what else, cash expenses like for wood or things like that. But this is the general distribution of what I spent my money on. Right here is the infamous Denali trip. This was the best backpacking trip and probably my highlight of the entire road trip. Backpacking in Denali National Park in Alaska. Alaska. Circling back to the expenses, this shows my most common expenses. Number one, easily Walmart. I shopped at Walmart all the time, mostly because they have everything from food to camping equipment to car gear to clothes to gadgets, electronics. They have everything at a low price. So besides Walmart, you see a bunch of different gas stations up there: Shell, Circle K, Exxon, things like that. $300 for Planet Fitness, that's $25 for 12 months. National Parks Pass, I bought 2 of them, so that was $160 plus some money for camping and wood and entering state parks and places, national parks that weren't actually covered under the National Parks Pass. And then you see some of the random expenses at the bottom, like Starbucks coffee, Aldi, UPS for shipping things, Publix, Chipotle, and Dunkin' Donuts. This right here was one of my favorite camping spots towards the end of the trip. I believe this is in the Green Mountains of Vermont. I spent a few nights here. It did rain, but I got a couple of campfires in and cooked some good food and really reminisced on the entire trip. Alright, back to the expenses. I tracked my expenses by month, by state, by category, by establishment, really any way I could think of. And this shows it by month. So you see the first few months, October, November, December, is me gearing up for the trip and buying all sorts of supplies and things like that. And then the start of the trip in January, I spent a decent amount because I paid for a bunch of different recreational things, from whitewater rafting in West Virginia to a paddleboard tour in Florida. January was definitely a higher than expected month. After that, I kind of toned it down for a little bit. Once I got into June and July, I knew those would be my most expensive months because that is when I went to Alaska. So all that gas money is thrown in there in June in Alaska and Canada. So I spent $3,500 between those 2 months, it looks like. And then from there, every single month after that, I spent less. $1,600 to $1,350 to $1,260 to $905 to $645 to $171. I knew that the summer would be the most expensive, given that gas was pretty expensive as well. But I was happy to spend less money every single month after that. This sweet shot is from Padre Island National Seashore in Corpus Christi, Texas, or is near Corpus Christi at least. I spent 2 nights on this beach. It was cold and windy, but I still had an awesome view of the water and could fall asleep to the sounds of the waves crashing on the seashore. It was really cool. Alright, and lastly, on the expenses side of this trip, this shows it by state. So you see Virginia here is at the top, that is getting ready for the trip. So September, October, November, December basically of 21. Then after Virginia, you see Canada, New Mexico, Alaska, Colorado, Arizona, California, Utah. So these have been at the top of the charts for most nights in the state, most miles in the state, most expenses in the state, really everything. You know, I spent the most time there, so obviously I spent more money and drove around more. I mean, you can definitely see the positive correlation between all of these things: spending the time, the nights in the state, the money spent, and the amount of fun had. It's also really interesting to see the states that I didn't really spend money on. A lot of the times it was just because I was passing into another state. And I only stayed there for a day or two. Like Mississippi, I was only in there for a night or two and I already had groceries. Iowa, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, didn't spend any money in there. No gas was necessary, no groceries, no activities, no camping. Other states under 100, Mississippi, Wisconsin, I only spent 1 night and it was backpacking there. Nebraska, only 1 night on my way to the Dakotas. Kansas, only 1 night on my way to Oklahoma. So you get the picture. Kentucky, only 1 night on my way to Ohio. This picture is barely edited. I think the contrast is up just a tad, but I really didn't edit the colors at all. I mean, it looked like this. The sun was setting in Bisty Badlands, or Dinazine Wilderness area in New Mexico. Check it out if you've never heard about it. It looks like Mars and it feels like you're in a Star Wars planet. This is showing my miles per gallon for the entire trip, and it looks like this is chronological. And I started out with solid gas mileage, 22, even close to 23 in a few states. I mean, that was close to when I bought my truck, so that makes a lot of sense. And then once I got into Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, places like that. I started off-roading more. I don't know what else really. Maybe the heat was a factor, but the mileage definitely went down, probably because of the off-roading and driving at slow speeds in four-wheel drive and things like that. It really is quite amazing, all the free sites that you'll find just outside some of the most popular national parks in this country. This right here was right outside of Zion National Park. There is free dispersed camping along this road with an absolutely beautiful view of a canyon near Zion National Park in Utah. Back to the gas. This is a chronological chart of gas price per gallon that I paid for the entire trip. Now, there are a ton of different macroeconomic factors that go into this. Who really cares, right? But it was interesting to follow it throughout the trip as gas prices absolutely skyrocketed and then basically plummeted to go negative on the year, which was absolutely wild. But you see the tick up starting in February through May. That's when gas prices really started to take off in the US and probably everywhere around the world. And then you see this big spike in June and July, and you guessed it, that is in Canada. I paid more than $8 a gallon once in Canada. It was just a random gas station on the Alcan Highway in the middle of nowhere. I mean, there's no options. You have to get gas. So like, I don't know what it came out to be in Canadian dollars per liter, but when I did the conversion to US dollars per gallon, it was like low eights. It was absolutely wild. Slowly back lower as I get back into the US and as gas prices fall. This picture is from Letchworth State Park in upstate New York. This park deserves to be a national park. It's a state park, but it is better than maybe a quarter of the national parks that I've been to. They self-proclaim it to be the Grand Canyon of the East. I got to see it with the fall colors in bloom and the waterfalls were raging, and it was absolutely amazing. You should check it out. All right, wrapping this up, the last few slides. This shows my entire hike list. So it shows how many hikes I went on in each state, how many miles, the altitude gained, and I tried to put in a little note on where I went hiking. Not always the trail name, like in Florida I just said Everglades Slog, but I tried to at least put in somewhere that, you know, gave you the idea of where I hiked. And I believe California took the crown. I went on 4 hikes for 40 miles. That was mostly at Yosemite National Park and also a few other hikes in Joshua Tree. So I think Alaska came in close second at 35 miles. Most of that was Denali. I did a ton of walking around in Montreal and Quebec. That's not really a hike, but I mean, I was walking around all day for like 3 or 4 days in a row, and it was almost 20 miles. I figured I would include that, and yeah, I don't know. I tried to go on a hike as much as possible, but if I really wasn't feeling it, then I didn't. This right here is the Delicate Arch at Arches National Park in southern Utah. This is a really cool spot near Moab, and I would highly suggest doing this hike. And do the trail that gets you close to the arch and not the one with the further viewpoint, because that really is not worth it. You got to get up close and personal. Well, here is a simple gear list of everything that I bought before the trip. This is most of the gear. I did leave a few things out, and I got a bunch of stuff along the way as well. So this is kind of just what I started with for truck gear, safety gear, cooking gear, camera gear, and tech gear. Some of the more expensive things were the cameras, like the Canon, the drone, the Jackery, and the solar panel was a solid chunk there. I'd say it was all worth it in the end. You don't want to overbuy, but you do want to have a few luxury items that kind of just make it comfortable along the way. Lastly, this shot is from the Kofa National Wildlife Refuge in Arizona. I thought this was an awesome shot of the desert surroundings. This cool little man-made rock formation maze with a campfire in the middle and all sorts of pins and buttons and patches and honestly trash, but it looked like a cool view and I thought it made for a good picture. With that, thank you so much for watching this video and tuning in to my road trip. I thought it was really cool to kind of go over the stats for the road trip and quantify it a little bit. So I hope it was at least entertaining or maybe a little bit helpful for what you're doing. Yeah, I don't know. I just appreciate you tuning in and hopefully see you in the next video.